Everything you've been told about Polish cavalry charging German tanks is a lie created by Nazi propaganda, a lie repeated by Soviet propagandists, and a lie that somehow made it into your history books, your documentaries, and even your school classrooms. But the truth is way more interesting. September 1st, 1939, the very first day of World War II, German tanks are rolling across the Polish border. The most powerful military machine the world has ever seen is about to crush everything in its path, and standing in their way are men on horses. Sounds like a joke, right? Brave but stupid soldiers riding their horses straight into the treads of German panzers because they didn't know any better. That's the story you've heard. But here's what actually happened. Those Polish cavalry units didn't just survive. They made the Germans panic. They forced entire divisions to retreat. They destroyed dozens of tanks, and they became the only force that day to hand the German war machine an actual defeat. This is the real story of Polish cavalry in World War II. And it's nothing like what you think. Let's start with where this myth comes from, because understanding the lie helps us appreciate the truth. Picture this. It's September the 1st, 1939, near a small village called Krojanty in northern Poland. A German infantry battalion is resting in a forest clearing. About 800 soldiers, tired from marching all day. They think they're safe. They have no idea what's about to hit them. Colonel Kazimierz Mastalers is watching them through the trees. He's 44 years old, a veteran who has been fighting wars for most of his adult life. He served in World War I with the Polish legions. He fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, when Poland pushed back the Bolshevik invasion and saved itself from becoming a communist state. He's been commanding cavalry units for over 2 decades. And right now, he sees an opportunity. His 18th Pomeranian Uhlan regiment is outnumbered. The Germans have more men, more guns, more everything. His unit has been fighting all day, intercepting German soldiers moving toward Danzig and slowing their progress. But Mastalers spots something important. Those German soldiers in the clearing are exposed. They're not ready. Their weapons aren't positioned. They're not expecting an attack. If he hits them fast and hard right now, he can scatter them before they know what's happening. And that will buy time for other Polish units to retreat to better positions. One of his younger officers suggests they dismount and attack on foot. That's the modern way. That's how cavalry is supposed to fight in 1939. Use the horses to get into position, then fight as infantry. Mastalers looks at him and says something that will be remembered for generations. Young man, I am quite aware of what it is like to carry out an impossible order. He's done this before. He knows the risks, but he also knows that surprise is worth more than numbers. And right now, surprise is all he has. Then he orders the charge. 2 squadrons of Polish cavalry, about 250 men, burst out of the tree line at around 7 in the evening. Sabres drawn, horses at full gallop. The sun is setting behind them, and for a moment they must have looked like ghosts from another century. The Germans never see it coming. Within minutes, it's chaos. German soldiers are running in every direction. Some try to set up their machine guns. Some fire wild shots that hit nothing. The Polish cavalry tears through their lines, scattering the entire battalion like leaves in a storm. Soldiers who moments ago felt safe are now running for their lives. It's a complete success. And then everything changes. German armored cars come roaring out of a nearby forest road. These aren't the tanks everyone imagines, but they're deadly enough. Armored reconnaissance vehicles with machine guns and 20mm cannons. They open fire on the Polish cavalry still caught in the open. The Poles are completely exposed. There's no cover in the clearing. They try to retreat behind a small hill nearby, but the armored cars keep firing. About 20 to 25 men are cut down in minutes. Among them is Colonel Mastalers himself. He doesn't die immediately. When he sees that one of his squadron commanders, Eugeniusz Świeszczak, has fallen, Mastalers charges back into the kill zone to try to save him. Both men die there in that clearing, surrounded by dead horses and fallen soldiers. Now here's where the myth begins. The next day, the Germans bring journalists to the battlefield. Italian reporters, supposedly neutral. Germany and Italy are allies, but Italy hasn't entered the war yet, so Italian journalists can claim to be objective observers. The Germans show them the dead horses, the dead cavalrymen with their sabres, and then they point to some German tanks that had arrived at the clearing after the battle was already over. "Do you see what happened here?" they ask. "These foolish Poles charged our tanks with swords and lances. They didn't know any better. They thought our panzers were made of cardboard." One Italian journalist, Indro Montanelli, writes a story about brave but foolish Polish soldiers charging German tanks with medieval weapons. It's a great story, dramatic, romantic, tragic, and completely false. The Nazi propaganda machine loves this. They publish it everywhere. The official German military magazine Die Wehrmacht runs the story on September 13th, claiming the Poles had been told that German tanks were just fake vehicles made of sheet metal. They actually believed it, the article says. They charged our tanks thinking they could cut through them with sabres. It's a perfect story for the Nazis. It makes the Germans look modern and unstoppable. It makes the Poles look backwards and pathetic. It reinforces all their racist ideas about Slavic people being inferior. And it completely ignores what actually happened. The charge at Krojanty was a success. The Polish cavalry scattered a German infantry battalion. They achieved exactly what Masterlerz intended. They delayed the German advance. They stopped the German pursuit for the entire day. They allowed other Polish units, including the 1st Rifle Battalion and the Chersk Operational Group, to retreat safely. And they did it so effectively that German General Heinz Guderian himself wrote about the panic it caused. Guderian was the commander of the 99th Panzer Corps. He's famous as the father of German tank warfare, the architect of Blitzkrieg, one of the most brilliant military minds of the 20th century. And in his memoirs, he recorded something remarkable about that first day of war. He wrote that he found his own staff officers wearing helmets and preparing anti-tank guns. Why? Because they were afraid of another Polish cavalry attack. These were German headquarters soldiers, far behind the front lines, and they were so spooked by the Polish cavalry that they were getting ready to defend themselves. Guderian also wrote about how one of his division commanders requested permission to withdraw. The 2nd Motorized Infantry Division had been fighting Polish cavalry all day, and they wanted to pull back. Guderian was shocked. He wrote that he was speechless for a moment. When he got his voice back, he asked the divisional commander if he had ever heard of German soldiers being broken by enemy cavalry. The implication was clear. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it almost did. The cavalry charge at Krojanty impressed the Germans so much that it caused a delay in their entire offensive. The 20th Motorized Infantry Division actually considered retreating. Only Guderian's personal intervention stopped them, but that's not the story the world heard. The world heard about stupid Poles charging tanks with lances, and it gets worse. After the war, Soviet propaganda picked up the same myth. They used it to show how the old Polish aristocracy had thrown away the lives of peasant soldiers with their stupid old-fashioned tactics. It fit their communist narrative perfectly. The rich nobles were incompetent and careless with working-class lives. The myth made it into books. It made it into documentaries like The World at War, one of the most respected World War II series ever made. Even historians like William Shirer repeated it in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Even Guderian himself, in his own memoirs, lied about what happened. He claimed Polish cavalry charged his tanks out of ignorance. He wrote that the Pomorska Cavalry Brigade, in ignorance of the nature of our tanks, had charged them with swords and lances and had suffered tremendous losses. He knew it wasn't true, but the myth was too useful. In 2009, the Guardian newspaper published an article calling the charge at Krojanty the most romantic and idiotic act of suicide of modern war. They had to issue a correction 2 weeks later, admitting they had repeated a Nazi propaganda myth. And that's the problem. The myth won't die because everyone had a reason to keep it alive. The Germans used it to look superior. The Soviets used it to mock the old Polish government. And lazy historians kept repeating it because it made for a good story. But the real story is so much better. To understand what really happened in September 1939, you need to understand who these men actually were. The Polish cavalry wasn't some medieval holdover. They weren't knights who forgot what century they lived in. They were some of the most well-trained, well-equipped, and elite soldiers in the Polish army. They consumed 60% of Poland's entire military budget. They were the cream of Polish society. Let's go back in time for a minute. Poland has one of the most legendary cavalry traditions in the entire world, and it starts with something that sounds almost too crazy to be real: the Polish winged hussars. These were heavy cavalry soldiers who literally wore giant wings attached to their backs or saddles. Huge wooden frames covered with eagle feathers, sometimes ostrich or swan feathers, that arched over their heads. When they charged into battle, those feathers would flutter and rustle, creating a sound that combined with the thunder of thousands of horses into something absolutely terrifying. They wore elaborate armor decorated with gold. They rode the finest horses in Europe. They carried lances over 16 feet long, so light they could only be used once before breaking, but so deadly that one charge could break an entire army. And they weren't just for show. The winged hussars were basically unbeatable for over 100 years. From 1577 to 1683, they won battle after battle against impossible odds. At the Battle of Kirchholm in 1605, about 3,000 Polish hussars attacked a Swedish army of 11,000 men. They didn't just win, they destroyed the Swedish army in 20 minutes. The Swedes lost 8,000 men. The Poles lost about 100. At the Battle of Klushino in 1610, a Polish army that was outnumbered 5-1 defeated a combined Russian and Swedish force. The winged hussars broke through the enemy lines again and again until the entire army collapsed. But their greatest moment came in 1683. The Ottoman Empire had surrounded Vienna with over 100,000 soldiers. The city had been under siege for 2 months. The walls were crumbling. The defenders were starving. Ottoman sappers were digging tunnels under the fortifications, filling them with explosives. Vienna was days, maybe hours, from falling. If Vienna fell, all of Central Europe would be open to Ottoman conquest. The fate of Christian Europe hung in the balance. Then the Polish king, Jan III Sobieski, arrived. He had marched his army across hundreds of miles to honor a treaty with the Holy Roman Empire. He brought about 20,000 Polish soldiers, including roughly 3,000 winged hussars. They joined forces with German and Austrian troops under Charles of Lorraine. On September 12, 1683, the combined army launched its attack from the Kahlenberg Heights overlooking Vienna. At around 6 in the evening, Sobieski himself led the cavalry charge. 18,000 horsemen came pouring down from the hills, the largest cavalry charge in the history of the world. Sobieski was at the head of his winged hussars. The Ottoman soldiers saw those feathered wings coming down the mountain, heard the thunder of hooves and the flutter of 1,000 feathers, and their morale collapsed. They had been fighting for months. They were exhausted, and now angels of death were descending on them. The charge smashed through the Ottoman lines. Within 3 hours, the battle was over. The Ottoman army was running. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa barely escaped with his life. He would be executed by his own people on Christmas Day for his failure. The Ottoman Empire never recovered. That battle marked the end of their expansion into Europe, the beginning of their long decline, and it happened because of Polish cavalry. So when we talk about Polish cavalry in 1939, we're talking about soldiers who carried that legacy, the descendants of men who saved Europe from the Ottomans, men who had been raised on stories of glory and honor and doing the impossible, but they weren't stupid. By 1939, the Polish cavalry had completely modernized. They weren't charging into machine guns and tanks with nothing but lances. That's the myth. The reality was totally different. Polish cavalry units by 1939 were essentially mounted infantry. They used their horses to move quickly from one position to another. Horses don't need gasoline. They can go through forests and swamps where vehicles get stuck. They're quiet. They're cheap. In a country like Poland, which couldn't afford to build massive tank armies like Germany, horses made practical sense. But when it came time to fight, 90% of the time, these cavalry soldiers would dismount and fight on foot with modern weapons. And what weapons did they have? Anti-tank rifles. Poland had developed a secret weapon called the WZ-35 anti-tank rifle. It was so classified that Polish soldiers weren't even allowed to open the boxes they came in. The crates were marked as surveillance equipment for Uruguay to fool any spies. These rifles could penetrate the armor of any German tank of that era at distances up to 300 meters. The Germans had no idea they existed until they captured some during the war. They were so impressed that they copied the design and used captured Polish rifles themselves. Anti-tank guns. Polish cavalry brigades were equipped with 37mm Bofors anti-tank guns, 4 guns per regiment. These could destroy any German tank at the time. Machine guns, both light and heavy. Every cavalry unit had them. Tankettes, small TKS and TK3 reconnaissance tanks that provided mobile firepower. Artillery, horse-drawn 75mm guns and howitzers. The lance, the bee, saber. Those were tools of last resort, things you might use if you caught infantry by surprise in the open, like at Krojanty. But nobody was planning to charge tanks with them. Polish military manuals specifically discussed anti-tank tactics. They trained for ambushes. They studied how to use terrain against armored vehicles. A Polish cavalry officer named Klemens Rudnicki, who commanded the 9th Lancers in 1939 and would later lead the 1st Polish Armored Division in Western Europe, explained it clearly. He said Poland simply didn't have the money or industrial capacity to build massive tank armies. So they adapted. They used what they had. And they made it work. The result was cavalry units that were fast, flexible, well-armed, and absolutely lethal when used correctly. September 1st, 1939. The same day as the charge at Krojanty, but about 120 miles to the south. The German 4th Panzer Division is advancing into Poland near the town of Częstochowa. This is one of the most powerful armored units in the world. Approximately 200 tanks and armored vehicles, thousands of infantry, artillery, air support, modern equipment, aggressive commanders who believe completely in the new doctrine of blitzkrieg, fast, overwhelming attacks that crush enemy resistance before they can organize a defense. Their objective is simple: smash through the Polish defenses, race toward Warsaw, end this war in weeks. Standing in their way is the Wawinska Cavalry Brigade under Colonel Julian Filipowicz. About 3,000 Polish soldiers, mostly cavalry, dismounted and dug into defensive positions. A handful of TKS tankettes, some horse-drawn artillery, an armored train called Śmiały, which means bold in Polish. On paper, this should be a massacre. The Germans have overwhelming firepower. They have the Luftwaffe providing air strikes. They have everything they need to roll over this single brigade in hours. But Colonel Filipowicz isn't planning to meet them in the open. He's been preparing. The terrain around the village of Mokra is perfect for defense. Rolling hills covered with dense forests. A railway embankment running through the area that can serve as a fortified position. The ground is soft and boggy in certain areas, which will slow down tanks and channel them into predictable approaches. Filipowicz positions his men carefully. The 19th Uhlan Regiment and 21st Uhlan Regiment are spread across the defensive line. Anti-tank guns are hidden in the trees with clear fields of fire. Machine gun nests cover every approach. His cavalry is ready to plug any gaps in the line or counterattack exposed infantry. And then there's the armored train. Shmiawi is a beast of a machine. It has two 100mm howitzers capable of destroying anything the Germans have, two 75mm cannons, 19 machine guns, a crew of 170 men, all mounted on a train that can race up and down the railway, appearing where the Germans least expect it, armoured. Trains might sound old-fashioned, but in the right terrain, with railway lines running through the battlefield, they're incredibly effective mobile artillery platforms. And today, Shmiawi is about to prove its worth. The Germans launch their first probing attacks in the early morning. Luftwaffe planes bomb the Polish positions, trying to soften them up. Artillery opens fire, then the tanks start rolling forward. The main German assault comes around 10 in the morning. About 100 tanks, mostly Panzer I and Panzer II models, come advancing toward the Polish positions near the village of Mokra. These are light tanks by later standards, with thin armour and small guns, but in September 1939 they're supposed to be unstoppable. They're wrong. The Polish 37mm anti-tank guns open fire from hidden positions at about 150 metres. The Germans expected to be facing poorly equipped defenders. Instead, they're running into a carefully prepared kill zone. Two panzers are destroyed immediately, burning, crew members trying to escape. The rest of the German tanks try to back up to about 400 metres and return fire, but they lose two more tanks in the process. The German infantry that was supposed to support the tank attack is caught in the open. They're on flat ground directly in front of the Polish machine guns, with no cover whatsoever. Polish cavalry counterattacks on horseback, and the German infantry breaks and retreats with heavy losses. And then Shmiawi arrives. The armoured train comes roaring down the tracks right into the middle of the battle. Its massive guns open fire from a range of almost 2.5 kilometres. That's far beyond what any German tank gun can shoot back at effectively. The German tanks are getting hit by shells they can't even see coming. German tanks start exploding. The 4th Panzer Division has never faced anything like this. Their commanders are confused. Their carefully planned assault is falling apart. By midday, the Germans try again. Another wave of about 100 tanks, another assault on the village of Mokra itself. This time they manage to break through in a few places. They push the Polish 4th Squadron of the 21st Regiment back and start fighting house to house in the village. The houses start burning. Smoke fills the air. The 21st Regiment has to withdraw toward the railway line, but isolated groups of Polish soldiers stay behind in the village, causing chaos and confusion among the German tanks trying to advance. And again, Shmiawi appears at exactly the right moment. The armoured train's guns blast the German tanks from a distance they can't reach. More panzers burn. The German advance stalls again. Then comes one of the most extraordinary moments of the entire campaign. Polish Major Stanisław Glinski leads a counterattack with elements of the 21st Armoured Battalion, mostly TKS Tankettes, and a cavalry squadron under Captain Jerzy Holak. They're supposed to hit the German flank and retake the village. But in the smoke and chaos of the burning buildings, something goes wrong. Or maybe something goes right. They accidentally drive straight into the middle of a German tank column. Polish tankettes weigh about 2.5 tons. German Panzer II tanks weigh about 9 tons. This shouldn't even be a contest. Polish cavalry on horseback against tanks should be instant death. But the Germans are completely confused. The smoke is everywhere. They don't know what's happening. They can hear firing all around them. And suddenly there are Polish soldiers and vehicles right in the middle of their formation. In that moment of chaos, the Polish unit does the only thing they can. They punch straight through. Holak's cavalry charges through the German column. The tankettes follow. They don't stop. They don't try to fight. They just go as fast as they can. And somehow, impossibly, they make it out the other side. They seize the forest on the northwest edge of Mokra. The German tanks, having lost all sense of where the enemy is, withdraw from the village entirely, again. This wasn't a planned cavalry charge against tanks, it was an accident, a mistake that became a legend. But it worked because the Poles were bold, aggressive, and willing to take risks that the Germans simply didn't expect. By the end of September 1st, 1939, the German 4th Panzer Division had failed to achieve any of its objectives. They had lost over 50 tanks and armoured vehicles, possibly more. They had suffered around 1,200 casualties, dead and wounded, and they had been stopped cold by a force that was supposed to be swept aside in hours. The Polish defenders had lost about 500 men, painful but far fewer than they inflicted on the Germans. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group South, later wrote in his official report about the battle. He said something that the Nazi propaganda machine definitely didn't want people to hear. The Polish cavalry attacked heroically. In general, the bravery and heroism of the Polish army merits great respect. This is the enemy commander, giving credit to Polish cavalry. Not mocking them, not calling them stupid, respecting them. The Battle of Mokra wasn't the only success. Throughout the September campaign, Polish cavalry fought brilliantly. During the Battle of the Bzura, which started on September 9th, Polish forces launched the largest counter-offensive of the entire campaign. The Poznan army, under General Tadeusz Kościuszko, noticed that the German 8th Army had left its northern flank exposed. Only one German division was guarding a 30-kilometer stretch of front, while the rest raced toward Warsaw. Kościuszko attacked. Polish infantry divisions, supported by cavalry brigades like the Podolska and Wielkopolska, smashed into the German lines. They threw the Germans back 20 kilometers. They recaptured several towns. They killed or wounded 1,500 German soldiers and captured 3,000 more in the initial push alone. The cavalry brigades, equipped with their TKS tankettes and modern weapons, threatened the flanks and rear of the German forces. The German 2nd Motorized Infantry Division was so badly mauled that they reported wanting to withdraw. Guderian was speechless. The cavalry brigades at Bzura fought so hard that they allowed thousands of Polish troops to escape encirclement and make it to Warsaw and Modlin. They crossed the Campinos forest, fighting German units the whole way. Winston Churchill later called the Battle of the Bzura an ever-glorious struggle. Poland fell in September 1939. That's the hard truth. The German military was too powerful. The French and British didn't launch the offensive they had promised, and on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, making the situation completely impossible. No amount of cavalry heroism could change that. But here's what matters. The myth of stupid Polish cavalry charging tanks says that Poland was backwards, that they didn't understand modern warfare, that they threw away lives for no reason. The reality says something completely different. Polish cavalry in 1939 was elite mounted infantry. They were equipped with anti-tank rifles, anti-tank guns, machine guns, tankettes, and modern tactics. They dismounted to fight 90% of the time. When they did charge on horseback, it was against exposed infantry, not tanks, and they were devastatingly effective. At Krojanty, they scattered a German battalion and delayed an entire division. At Mokra, they handed the German 4th Panzer Division its first defeat of the war. At the Bzura, they launched one of the largest counter-offensives of the campaign and captured thousands of prisoners. They made German generals panic, they forced retreats, they destroyed tanks, and they proved that courage and skill can matter even against overwhelming odds. The myth was created by Nazi propaganda to make Poland look weak and Germany look strong. It was kept alive by Soviet propaganda to make the old Polish government look incompetent. It was repeated by lazy historians and sloppy documentaries for decades. And it's still floating around today, treating Polish soldiers like a punchline. But the truth is that Polish cavalry made the Germans afraid. They proved that the Blitzkrieg wasn't unstoppable, and they gave their country time to evacuate soldiers, pilots, codebreakers, and intelligence assets that would go on to fight for the entire rest of the war. Polish pilots flew in the Battle of Britain. Polish Squadron 303 had the highest kill rate of any Allied squadron. Polish mathematicians helped crack the Enigma code before the war even started and shared their work with British intelligence. Polish soldiers fought in North Africa, Italy, France, and the Netherlands. They never stopped fighting, and in March 1945, Polish cavalry charged one more time at the Battle of Schoenfeld in what is now northwestern Poland. The 1st Warsaw Independent Cavalry Brigade faced German fortifications that tanks and infantry had already failed to break. They had a choice: wait for more support or do what Polish cavalry had always done. 2 squadrons formed up in the cover of nearby woods. They waited for a red flare. Then they charged. They rode through smoke and fire across 2 kilometers of open ground. They overran German anti-tank gun positions with sabres and hand grenades. They burst into the village itself and scattered the defenders. 7 Polish cavalrymen died, 124 Polish infantry, 16 tank crewmen from the supporting units. The Germans lost about 500 men. It was the last successful cavalry charge in the history of warfare, and it was Polish, and it was a victory. So the next time someone tells you about stupid Polish cavalry charging German tanks, you can tell them the real story. Polish cavalry knew exactly what they were doing. They were modern soldiers using horses for mobility and modern weapons for killing. They fought with skill, with courage, and with a tradition that stretched back centuries to the winged hussars who saved Europe at Vienna. They weren't a joke. They were terrifying, and the Germans knew it. If you want to learn more about the forgotten heroes of World War II, hit subscribe.